Amazing talk. And it feels strange having Kelsey Hightower introduce you to the stage. I feel like it should be the other way around, but I like it. We can do this more often. Amazing talk, and I remember seeing this talk about hidden figures years ago, and it really stuck with me how so many analogies we can draw from this movie to the software world, and all these analogies with value that we are talking about these 2 days are simply amazing. And I actually wanted to go with you through some of these types of value that we can pull from this movie story and from our everyday life. So one thing that we are all here interested for is value for our customers. And there are many ways in which we can think about value. And QED has always been a conference where we put the technology people and business people together at the same table. So how do you see this relationship between business and technology in creating value for the customers?
I mean, look, I've worked in the enterprise for half of my career, and I work for technology companies like Google, Puppet Labs, CROZ for the other half. And I think when it comes to business value, you know, the job of a business is definitely to provide value to their customers. That's the end game. And ideally, the best businesses have a great feedback loop with their customer base, right? Your customer pays you, and typically they would like to see either product improvements or something that actually makes the product worth using. And so if you have that strong feedback loop, then ideally you have the chance at being successful in business. Now, on the other side of that equation, the technologists that try to help execute. Given the experience that a technologist has, when a business has an idea, depending on what your tool belt has in it, or the experience building previous products, you can actually help a business execute on those ideas. It should be that simple. The problem, though, is I think a lot of businesses are distracted. I think one of the goals of anyone in the business side is to take big ideas through collaboration with whether it's engineering org, is to take the big ideas and turn them into boring plans that people can execute on. That's the hard part. That's the gray area. The clearer those plans are, the easier it is to execute. And then you can actually make those intelligent buy versus build decisions. When they're not clear, people just start guessing. We call them POCs. We call them sprints. We call them agile. And a lot of times we're literally just guessing because we aren't clear what the end game is. If you can close the gap and clear that gray area up, I think that's where the best companies execute.
I feel like we as an industry have always had more success when we were thinking in terms of how can we enable people to lead better lives with technology, instead the other way around. Let's master this technology and then let's figure out what we can do to fix other people's lives.
I'll be honest with you. If you're purely walking around with a full growth mindset, right? Growth is not always a positive thing. If you take a balloon and you continue to put air in it, what will happen to the balloon? It will pop. It will no longer be a balloon. Some organizations are this way. Some organizations have a pretty steady business, and the only thing they need to do is hold the promises that they make to their customers. That's it, and they will be fine. But if you get outside pressure to grow unnaturally, you start buying other companies that make no sense in your portfolio. You start adding features that no one really wants, but they're only there to try to increase the price of a product that people are already happy with. Growth can be very dangerous if it's unmanaged. And I think that particular mindset can cause confusion through an organization. So people would prefer strategy. I think when Steve Jobs went back to Apple, one of the most famous presentations he gave was that he wanted all of Apple's products to fit on one table. Anything that couldn't fit on that one table meant that there was going to be a distraction for the organization, and that was his goal of creating focus. And so I think if you give a delivery team an area to focus, then they can actually make better decisions and get some reusability out of the things that they're building. So I think there's that bit of tension around perpetual growth at any cost and actually providing some stability and predictability to your customer base.
Let me use this also. I wanted to touch upon innovation cycles, which are getting shorter and shorter every day, and we can see all of that. If you remember, new cell phones used to come out every 5 or 6 years. Now we have a new version every year. There is also a nice analogy that I found we here in Croatia are huge Volkswagen fans. And I learned yesterday that Kelsey also drives a Volkswagen, so we are all here together.
Yeah, I drive an electric
huge
Volkswagen
fans.
ID4.
Yeah, and did you know, fun fact, that it took Volkswagen 9 years to get from Golf 1 to Golf 2, and only 4 years to get from Golf 6 to Golf 7. That's a reduction of 55% in an innovation cycle. So this is the example of the speed that we are talking about these days. And in the last 5 or 6 years, we got serverless, we got MLOps, we got generative AI, we got quantum computing. I won't even go into a number of libraries and frameworks, new frameworks that came out in this period. So do you feel sometimes like we as an industry are moving too fast? Is it even possible to move too fast?
I think we're moving fast if you haven't been paying attention. So if you think about most of the technologies you've named, they're all based on the same platforms. That car doesn't look much different than the other car. All the flaws in that car were probably fixed in this one. And so I think for those that don't know what these cycles take to evolve, you may look up one day, and a lot of people have done this. I've met a lot of technologists that have been doing this for 20 years. The sad side of it all is they only have 20 years of 1 year experience. They've been doing the same thing over and over again. When Docker came out, which is a core component to the open source projects that I work, the idea of containerization, a lot of people who were not paying attention saw this as a net new thing. A lot of people that were paying attention, we saw this as a recycled idea from the IBM days, LPARs, the Solaris days of zones. But if you were not paying attention and you were just running scripts your whole career, you may have missed that this abstraction was there sitting and waiting for people. So it's not that they evolve very quickly, it's just that you can get very far not paying attention. And then you hit the stumbling block where you no longer can compete. If you don't have a database, and there are some industries that still run everything on paper and pencil, you can no longer compete because your customer wants to see or retrieve a copy of the receipt 2 years from now. And now you have to go rummage through paper to do that. You've now hit a brick wall. And so a lot of this technology has been there. And what is that saying? That technology is not evenly distributed. So there's things you can do now that some people are 10 years away from even acknowledging exists. So I think it actually evolves painfully slow for the people that are in the thick of it. Mm-hmm. But I think what is faster, to your point, is the adoption curve. Once you're ready now to adopt these new technologies, and I think this has a lot to do with the cloud, you no longer need to hire all the expertise to actually do it internally. Now you have advisors and consultants and managed services that says, hey, whenever you're ready, put your data here and we're going to return you value in months and not years. And I think that's probably the most exciting part.
Yeah, you're right. And if this adoption capacity of organizations is rising, and we suddenly see new things coming up, are we in jeopardy of becoming hype-driven? We've all seen slides like this one with a number of technologies popping up every month, I would say. Are we in jeopardy of throwing away everything that we have for the sake of embracing some new promise that is going on?
I mean, I look at that whole chart, and again, I see old technology being rebranded. Let's just take Web3, for example. Lots of people were really hyped about Web3, decentralized systems, decentralizing platforms like Twitter and finance. But if you think about the origins of the internet are already decentralized. Nothing is stopping you from running your own web server. There's a reason why you don't run your own web server. Nobody cares about your blog post. You might get two viewers, right? Your wife and your grandma, right? You want to be a part of a larger community. There's a reason why people gravitate to shared platforms. It's not by mistake. It's by choice. There's a lot of value in discovering new content. There's a lot of value in finding an audience. So instead of hanging out by yourself with a single server, this idea of being part of a larger community is very important to humans. Buzzwords are helpful in one degree. They help us get shared vocabulary to describe the thing that we're trying to solve. And then once we kind of get the fundamentals out of that, the buzzword can disappear. It's irrelevant at that point. And in order to have people behind these ideas, you need this curve because there's too much for people to process already.
Yeah. And you mentioned fundamentals right now, and you mentioned it also in the talk. If these things are for some organizations and for some people coming too quickly, although they are built deeply rooted into old ideas, but there is some twist in all of these ideas. And if these things change a bit, what it is that a technologist can cling on in this fast-moving world? Are those fundamentals that you were talking about?
I mean, if you have a roadmap, most platform teams don't have a roadmap. Everything is organic, right? Someone went to a conference and they bought SAP. They came back and now someone is installing SAP and they're telling me that I need to start learning it and they're going to send me to training. There is no strategic analysis being done of just getting in your car and driving around and hoping you end up at a place to eat. It is much better to have a strategy before you leave home. If you understand what you're trying to build, you only buy the tools you need. Hey, I am framing a wall. Great. You need hammer, you need these screws, and that's it. And I was like, I really want a new tape measure. I could really use a power saw, not for this project, you don't. That most of this stuff isn't changing that fast. Seriously, nothing on this list represents a new evolution of technology. We're still using x86 instruction set. Most people are still creating binaries that could have worked 30 years ago. And most people are copying bits to a server, showing stuff to people that they click on the browser that they were doing in the late 90s. There has not been a huge evolution in what we're doing.
One thing I love about your work is that despite being a strong technologist, you are still very critical about technology and very critical about the value and it should provide and purpose that it serves. How do you do that? How do you assess new technologies in terms of value?
I remember when I joined Google for the first time, I joined an advocacy role, developer advocacy. And there's a lot of shame that comes with that title. For the uninitiated, you believe that these are people who just go on stage and try to sell you something. Why? Because a lot of people do that. And so there's this distinction between evangelism and advocacy. Evangelism is when you go on stage and say, you should buy NFTs because they're going to go up in value. You don't even need to know how they work, but you can say it and you evangelize. You can say the same thing about Kubernetes. If you rub Kubernetes on your problems, they will go away. And you will convince some people to believe this. And it may actually work for some people, and then you get this reinforcing loop that that's all you need to do to get people to adopt Kubernetes. And then there's advocacy. Advocacy is when you say, I don't think you should run your database on Kubernetes because you're going to lose your data. And you explain to people exactly how. Here's how your database runs today. Here's what's required for that to run safely. Here are the 12 missing things from Kubernetes in order to meet that challenge. If you try this too early, here's the problem and burden you're going to put on your team. You're going to have them doing a bunch of work that provides no value. You can do it if you want to, but it's the wrong thing to do now. And so there's another saying, it's easy to predict the future when you're working on it. So when someone says, what is the future of Kubernetes? It's all the things that it doesn't do now. And so the people that are working to close those gaps, the advocacy piece, it's a feedback loop, right? So when you look at technology, you ask yourself, what does it do now and what should it do later? And that stuff in the gray area is the thing that goes on the roadmap. And so for me, when I look at new technology, if it has a strong foundation, I challenge it. Does it even need to exist? Or is there something that does it already? That's step one. So once we are clear that a new tool should exist or the fundamentals should be revisited, then we ask ourselves, what gaps do we need to close for the target audience? And rinse and repeat for any technology. And so that's the formula I always use. So at Google, one of the signs of success for me has always been, we've launched a thing, and it doesn't work for this group of people, and it should work for them. How do we prioritize improvements so that way we can follow up with those people and say, this thing is now ready for your use case? And if you do that for a decade, then your technology becomes mature. And a lot of the late adopters on these curves, the late adopters show up after that 10-year period where we've worked out all of these things. So they tend to inherit a bunch of value just by waiting, right? But if you want to be on the other side of this and you want to be able to dictate the future, and I think this is what even enterprises are learning. Enterprises were very afraid of open source in the beginning because they were unsure of the support, the maturity, and the security parameters around it. But I think what you're seeing now from modern enterprises, it also gives them a chance to control their own destiny. If you're in an industry that needs a particular set of features, it's one thing to pray to your vendor to hope that they implement them. It's another to hire your engineers to make it happen at the industry-wide level. That's a game changer. So I think now the relationship between vendor and your common enterprise is very different. A lot of enterprises now would like the vendor's technology to be based on open source, so there's this release valve. When there's value that doesn't make sense for your general customer base, I would still like to add it somehow through a plugin or an extension. So I think that's where we are. But this is all about that advocacy feedback loop. If you can't solve it for the customer, give them endpoints or a place to create their own ecosystem to close the gap.
Yeah. And when we are talking about this dichotomy of let's say, business and technology, can you share some practical advice on how to achieve that balance between business and technology, that balance that enables people to lead better lives, enables business to go as fast as possible, that enables humankind to be better than it was yesterday, all the while leaving enough leeway for technology to develop further?
I mean, if you just look at the problems, like I look at some of the underdeveloped countries that don't have electricity. And what it would take to get electricity is a huge capital investment. And typically when you're dealing with technology at that level, you're also dealing with politics. This isn't just find the right engineers to install the power grid. That's not how this works. There are some people that don't want a power grid there in the first place. And a lot of enterprises are built this way as well. Typically, it's not about finding the right solution. It's about convincing other people that this is the right solution. So most enterprises also mirror a political structure. And so when I think about technology these days, going back to the example of places without electricity, you see these people be made aware of that if one solar panel on top of one roof is enough to at least charge a cell phone or a laptop. And now everyone in that particular community has one solar panel, and they can do this for $35 a year. That's a game changer. We want this technology so we can have 1,000-mile range batteries or a backup plan at our homes. For some people, a scaled-down version of this technology means getting constant electricity for the first time. So when I see people solving human problems, this is what I mean. You look at a human condition and you say, what could we do to democratize access to the technology? And it turns out a lot of the technology simply needs to be scaled down so it's accessible. Like a cell phone is a game changer to people that don't have access to a financial system. So instead of trying to establish one, if you can scale down the cell phone to one that costs less than $50, which exists in the market, then you can change the game. If you're an insurance company, one of the terrible things about getting insurance is filling out all the forms. You ever fill out forms for like a doctor's office or insurance? Like, why are you asking me the questions, the data you already have? Why am I filling this out again? And sometimes it's very delightful to log in and they say, hey, we've pulled this information from an existing database, just verify that it's correct, and I will give you a policy in minutes. Instead of having to drive to someone to quote a policy based on some weird risk formula, now we have machine models that do a better job of giving you instant access. And I think a lot of times the frustration I see in most enterprises are a lot of people have no clue what they're doing. I don't know, I'm just doing agile. Every 2 weeks I give this person reports, the lines go up and to the right, and I would ask a question, what happens if your project never shipped? It's like, I don't know, we've been working on this for 5 years, it hasn't shipped so far. This is a massive problem. And so the question you asked is so important because even when I was a practitioner, I used to ask, why am I doing what I'm doing? First job that I had that had a high degree of regulation, a high degree of responsibility beyond just having a cool technology that people would come around and buy. And when I joined that company, this was the first time I was on call, and it's the first time I ever was in what they call a war room, right? There's an outage. You gather people into this war room, and they sit there. And I knew this company had problems because people had assigned seats. People sat in the same spot. I'm like, how often do you do this? And they're like 2 or 3 times a month. And they get in this room, and there's this phone in the middle of the table, that Polygon phone that costs a lot. Like, you never see these in anyone's houses, but they have them in office buildings. And on that phone is the executive team, breathing weird. Is it done yet? Like, no. What are you all doing? Looking at the logs with grep. Do you want to see that? And they're like, no, just tell us when it's done. And so I'm sitting in this war room, and on the projector behind us, almost like this, there's all of our metrics and alerts. Some of them are red, some of them are green, and no one has an idea what any of them actually mean, but they're colorful, and you need them. Red is bad. When we make them all green, good. And so people would be looking at them like, oh, one went green, but that one doesn't matter, it doesn't really mean anything. And so the team went through the routine. One person starts restarting servers. You guys know how this works, right? Even though we're doing all this other stuff, we're just going to restart the right server eventually, and it's going to just turn green. But while that's happening, you pretend that you're strategically doing something. Check this, check that. It doesn't mean anything. And the CTO walked in. His name is Paul Daffin. And he walked in, and he was visibly frustrated. We're working in financial services. And we were one of those companies that if you look at your credit card, those first 4 digits tell you who's actually processing the credit card for you. In the United States, not only did we process those commercial credit cards, we also processed the food assistant cards. And these food assistant cards are very important because back then, before those cards, they used to give people a different kind of money, food stamps. They look visibly different. And so if you pull one of them out, you can be embarrassed because people would know instantly that you're on government assistance. And so they gave people these debit cards, and it brought a lot of dignity to this process. So imagine you're in the grocery store and you're shopping, and the grocery basket is full of food, and you have this credit card that looks like everyone else's credit card. And you swipe at the terminal, and it doesn't work. Well, the reason why it doesn't work is there's one company in the United States that has this outage, and we're in the war room, and we're taking our sweet time because this outage happens all the time. And so Paul Daffin reminded us of what was happening. All those red things on the left column, those are all the declines for people using these EBT cards to buy food. Unlike our other customers, they don't have another credit card that they can just switch to complete the purchase. They have to leave the food there empty-handed. And those people are only going to the grocery store because that's the only option that they have. And so while we were messing around and playing around, there were real people that couldn't get access to food. This wasn't about going on vacations or watching a movie. This was a critical life need that we were failing at our jobs to do. And at that point, I realized that this work that we actually do, there is more value than just doing the next deployment. Ideally, you're deploying something that is important for the people on the other side. And so as a technologist, no matter where I've worked, I've always understood and being able to clearly articulate every keystroke that I'm doing is contributing to this particular thing. And if I don't get it right, here's what happens. And if I'm working on something where I can't tell that story, then I know I need to go work on something else until I can.
This is such a great seg to I don't think, guys, you could have gotten a better introduction for jobs to be done workshop. So, and also huge introduction to Enclave story that we will hear later on in the day about the mission. So amazing. But let us switch gears now a little bit and move from value for customers to value for people. So how can we enable their personal growth? This is one quote of yours that I like very much. At some point I wanted to put it on stickers and on everyone's laptop computers in CROZ. It says, a career in tech is less about learning a specific tool as it is the willingness to learn a different tool when the time comes. What did you mean by that? I mean, this is such a nicely put, all those thinking that we sometimes try to articulate to other people, but maybe fail to put it this concisely.
I mean, look, when you're working with people, people are very unique. They all have their own lived experiences. They have their own expectations. And if you try to treat them the same, bad things tend to happen. If you're a doctor and you use the same test to determine if someone has a disease or not without taking in the particulars of that person, you can have a misdiagnosis. And so maybe you need to learn a different technique in order to service that particular person. And again, I meet a lot of technologists that say something like, I am my HR title when they introduce themselves. I am a Linux system administrator, level 3. And that's all they can see for themselves. And so when you ask them to do something, they can only think in that context of the Linux server. And if they can't figure it out on the Linux server, they may say something like, this can't be done. Or it will take years because I can't see a world where that can happen. And so in that particular situation, that person may have to realize that the time has come that this is no longer the path forward. And it can be very hard because all of your expertise is there. You've dedicated so much of your time, and a lot of time your value is determined by that set of skill set. And so I ask people, you have to believe that you're more than your HR title that was given to you. And so when the time comes, it's like when I go and explore technology, I'm just looking for the art of the possible. What have the best minds come together to deliver? And I'll ask a question, even if I can't use it today, what is this good for? When I was at Puppet Labs, this is around the dawn of DevOps, and I joined this company that was disrupting everyone doing things manually or homegrown tools. And we thought configuration management was the way forward, automate everything, faster, cheaper, better. And we thought that infrastructure as code was the way forward. And so we would go out and tell everyone, automate everything. And that was the mantra, automate, automate, automate. And after 2 years, I remember Docker came out. And when containers came out, I remember it was almost banned. You couldn't even talk about it. It was just a fad. Containers are not great for the enterprise. It's distraction. Let's just focus on automation. That's the problem. And it turns out we were automating the wrong abstraction instead of creating new abstractions. So when containers came out, it broke the abstraction. Instead of targeting servers and SSH and bash scripts, they said, let's just create a new abstraction that will make that layer irrelevant. We didn't adjust at all. Most of those configuration management companies are not part of the new discussions that are happening for the future of technology. In most places, companies are just trying to remove that stuff and they treat it as technical debt. I had to leave that company. I had to leave Puppet Labs because they were unwilling to do this. Containers were not going to reverse backwards. The problem people were trying to solve wasn't the automation piece. People were trying to put software on a server so their customers could use it. That's what they were trying to do. And that mindset we had, we thought we should just automate the low-level details. And they ended up writing more infrastructure code than actual code. We were actually doing this backwards. And no one in the system administrative community thought to change the abstraction. And so the developers came. Solomon Hykes and these people trying to build a different platform. And they changed the abstraction. Not to make it easier to automate, but just to eliminate the need to do it all together. And so for those that switched, and I switched, I quit, I survived. I get to go and contribute to the Go programming language. I get to create tools in that space. I get to contribute on the thing that is now probably the more industry standard North Star that people have, because I was willing. And I still talk to some people that are still there. 8 years, and they're like, wow, turns out that container thing had momentum after all. But there was no reason to fight it in the beginning. It's just a new thing, and the question to ask is, why does it exist? And it typically exists because there's something that you're not currently delivering. And maybe you're right, it is a fad, but in this case, I think it was wrong. So I think a lot of technologists have not paid attention to the art of the possible in all of these domains, and they don't know when to switch. And a lot of times, the only option is to move in a different direction, sometime leaving those people behind.
Yeah. And I'm just wondering, and looking back at the conversation that we had over breakfast about some things becoming people's identity, what happens when something like technology becomes your identity? It's pretty difficult to get rid of it because you are basically surrendering your identity and changing it.
we talked about a very touchy topic, which was cryptocurrency. And I had a 2-month vacation from Google last year. And it's like maybe earlier this year, but I started reading the Bitcoin white paper. And I was like, all right, as a technologist, I am interested in how this works. I want to pay attention to what's possible. Everyone is talking about blockchain. If Walmart's talking about blockchain, then what the hell? I gotta see what the hell we're talking about. And I looked at the technology and I remember making some comparisons to, I was like, hey, if this is the description of blockchain, then wouldn't it be fair to say that GitHub is the world's most popular blockchain, if you think about how Git works and some of the similarities behind the protocol. And now if I was talking to technical people that were working on the technology, they said, hey, maybe it's a fair comparison. But there was another group of people who were attracted to this technology, not because of how the bits move, but because it represented hope. And I used to get into, and I've never seen debates like this. I've seen Vim versus Emacs. I've seen tabs versus spaces. I've seen people fight over their favorite programming language, but this is very different. I was having this debate on Twitter. I'm like, why am I debating on Twitter? And I DM'd the person. And this person had a picture that wasn't of them, and they had lasers coming out of their eyes, showing their support for the cryptocurrency movement. And I DM'd this person and said, hey, why are you so angry? I'm literally talking about technology, and for some reason you feel personally attacked. And I offered the person to let's just talk on DM. You don't have to score any political points. You don't have to pledge allegiance to the cryptocurrency of the United whatever. We can just have an honest, real person conversation. And ask the person about their situation. It's like, Kelsey, unlike you, I don't have any skills that I'm proud of. I don't see my ability to earn a stable income to do the things that I wanted to do. So the only thing that I see possible for me is to buy some cryptocurrency and hope it goes up. So the technology fascinates me because my success is now linked to the price of this thing. So when people like you come around and say the technology isn't the greatest thing since the internet, you're hurting my personal chances of being where I want to be. And what I realized is that I wasn't attacking the implementation of a particular blockchain. I was attacking this person's vision for themselves for the future. And a lot of technology, a lot of people have done this linkage where if the tech doesn't succeed, then they don't succeed because they haven't figured out how to decouple themselves from this. And I just stopped talking about cryptocurrency altogether because I realized that this wasn't a technical debate. These people wanted hope. These people were desperate, and some still are, because a lot of this technology does represent hope. Mainly for people like me, when I was getting into tech in 1999, there was no entry path that was easy. Having experience with Solaris and AIX mean you had to have access to those systems, and it cost a lot of money to get access to those systems. Luckily for me, I was born at the right time, that around 1999, you could go to the store and buy a magazine that had a CD in it, and it was like free operating system. And it was the closest approximation to Unix that I could get. And I can install this operating system, and right there I had access to the technology. So guess what? Even I was guilty, because if open source were to succeed, then guess what? I get to succeed with it. The gatekeepers can't protect all the gates in open source. So I too did link my identity to this idea of open source, this idea of the community meetup, where anyone could go, regardless of what college or regardless of what company. You could actually go and submerge yourself in the best and brightest ideas globally. And so for me, a big portion of what I did was surrounded by that identity. So on one half, I do encourage people not to link their identity to any particular technology, but on the other hand, I know how powerful it is for those communities that support those technologies to exist, because they give people like me a chance where the gate was too high otherwise. And so I think you just need to be careful. What's more important, the things you can do with the technology or the technology itself? And I think when you find the right answer, you'll find that there's hope in a lot of things, not just the particular implementation that exists today.
But the answer shouldn't be that difficult between those two.
It is difficult. It needs to be difficult because you have no idea any of the things that I'm talking about. When you first start, I just wanted a job. Whatever skills are required, I will take that job. If you tell me I need 7,000 years of AIX experience, I will lie and tell you I have 6,500 years and I can close the gap on the other. You're going to take that job, and in that job, you just want the paycheck to flow. You're not in position to negotiate. It's a real human thing. And so at that point, you're doing what's asked of you. Deploy this by Friday, by any means necessary. And then eventually, you do get to the point where you're really good and you can start thinking through, is this really the best way of doing this? Maybe someone new joins the team and they say, hey, at a different company, we found a better way of doing this. Can I show it to you? And I think that's when people start to break away. And that first time that you break away from that core technology that you entered the system with is when you realize, when I joined, it was all about bash scripts. And I learned Python. I stopped writing as much bash. And it felt bad because I was like, man, I'm looking at the bash interpreters like, I will come back to you, I promise. But I got to make this detour to Python land because there's some things I want to do that you aren't good at. And then you eventually go from Python to Ruby, from Ruby to Java, from Java to Golang. And you're like, it just doesn't matter. All of these languages in the right hands of someone determined can probably build what they want to build. But to be honest, that's a decade in the making for you to really realize that that is actually possible, especially if you've never seen yourself do that before. So I give people a bit of room to realize that. I do try to tell them that that is possible. So when I say the language doesn't matter, it's because you matter more.
This is such a great and concise way to actually articulate everything that we want to share in this community. Kelsey, thank you so much for this conversation. It was really great. We will talk again end of day in a panel session, so please feel free to stop by, and we will continue this great conversation. Thank you. Thank you, man.